Hey everyone, my name is Jazz and welcome to today's video. We're going to talk about a topic I've had many students ask me about: mentality and mental strength. Mentality has a lot of aspects and I'd like to help you with as many of them as possible over the course of maybe a couple videos. In this first video, I'm going to focus on a very important one: nervousness. First, we'll discuss how nervousness works, and then we'll talk about ways to decrease nervousness. And finally, I'll give you ways to trick your brain psychologically into being less nervous. I'll put timestamps in the description below if you're interested in a specific part, but some of these topics influence each other, so to eliminate nerves completely, I'd recommend watching the full video. Now, let's get started. There are many different reasons people get nervous, and I believe it might be one of, and maybe even the biggest problem for people in solos. In team modes, it seems to be far less of an issue, and I think I know why. In team modes, you're constantly communicating with your teammates, and you're not thinking very much internally about the things you usually get nervous about. Getting nervous usually happens when you're thinking too much about things outside of the moment. You're thinking about how many points you need, the amount of bad games you've had, how many shots you've been missing, and all the mistakes you've been making or the mistakes you feel like you're going to make. Getting nervous sucks. It makes you feel bad and play even worse. The positive thing though is that there's lots of different ways to decrease the amount of nerves you feel or even eliminate nerves completely. Confidence is the opposite of nervousness. Think about it. When you're confident, you feel like you can take on the world and you're focused on what's happening in the moment. You're not thinking about being nervous because that's not even crossing your mind. The only thing you're doing is thinking about your decisions and what you should do next. This leads us to the first way you can decrease nervousness. Think about what you should be doing next at all times and focus on what you need to do to accomplish this. If you're in the early game and you don't have shields yet, make that your goal and focus on that. If you're in the mid game and you need to rotate and farm mats, then think about how to do those things efficiently. It's basically impossible to tell yourself to not think about something. So instead of telling yourself to not be nervous or to not think about how bad you feel like you're playing, you should direct your focus outwards to what you should be doing next in game. Something that can help is talking to yourself about what you should do next. This way your thoughts don't run wild and you have a better understanding of what you're doing and why. Because if you're telling yourself what you're doing and what you're going to do next, then you've thought about it to the point that you can explain it, which means you have a clear idea of what you're doing. This builds confidence and reduces emotion from your thoughts. This technique works best if you're nervous outside of fights. During fights, this technique often isn't going to be your best option, seeing as fights are usually pretty fast-paced. But confidence is still key to not getting nervous in fights. By far, the most reliable way to not get nervous in fights is to just put yourself in as many of them as possible. And I don't mean to just play creative all day every day. You should figure out at what point in the fight you feel most nervous and find out what you should do in those situations. I had a student recently who got nervous in fights specifically when he was boxed up and his opponent would apply pressure to him. We figured out together that the main reason he got nervous is because he is a player who is always attacking and isn't used to being boxed up himself. So we went over the things he can do when he's boxed up so he has a better idea of his options during those situations. After understanding that, the only thing left for him to do was put it into practice and his nerves basically disappeared. If fighting in general makes you nervous and that's the main issue in tournaments for you, you should spend a full tournament not caring about your points and instead getting into a decent amount of fights in the mid game. This way you're exposing yourself to what makes you nervous voluntarily. And trust me when I say you'll be amazed by the impact one of these kinds of tournaments can have. Think about it this way. There are so many tournaments this season, literally about 5 each week per region. Sorry, did I say 5? There's like daily cups and everything. There's so many tournaments. I mean, you can even play other regions, it's crazy. Think about tournaments in the long term. Don't be afraid to do bad in your next tournament, because there's going to be so many more tournaments after that one. Use each tournament as a learning opportunity and see what you can improve on for the next one. This brings us to the third tip for tournaments specifically. If you're someone who gets nervous when you feel like you're not getting enough points, then this is going to help you a lot. Instead of looking at the amount of points other players are getting, you should only look at your own previous record. If you hit 80 points last week, you should aim for higher than 80 this week. And don't worry about what other players are going to do in the meantime. Setting these kinds of goals can put quite a load off of your shoulders, but still challenge you to do better than what you've done in the past. For the final tip, I'm going to give you guys some options to trick your brain into being less nervous. I've made a video in the past discussing different kinds of drinks you can start drinking during tournaments and the different effects these have on your mind, including energy drinks and tea. Now, I'm not going to go too in depth on this topic because I've already made a whole video on it, but black or green tea is a great option to reduce your nerves, and you should avoid energy drinks and coffee if nerves are an issue for you. I'll put the link to the video in the description below so you can find out for yourself what would be the best for you in your situation. There's a couple of other things you can do during tournaments to trick your brain into being less nervous, including chewing gum while you're playing. When you're chewing, your body is basically telling your brain, hey, you're fine and you're safe. Otherwise, you wouldn't be chewing. This is because in nature, animals are only eating when they're not in direct danger. So you can use this to trick your mind into feeling safe and less nervous. The final option I'm going to talk about in this video is talking to your friends during solo tournaments. This option has its benefits, but also some downsides. The benefits are that you'll probably be less nervous for the same reason you'd be less nervous in team modes. You're talking to your friends and not thinking too much about the things that make you nervous. The downsides, however, can be annoying. You can get distracted or even miss audio cues that you'd usually hear. So to minimize these risks, I'd recommend only being in a call or party chat with up to 3 or 4 people, and not more. This way, it's easier to tell others to be quiet when you're in an intense situation where you don't want to be distracted, and they can tell you to do the same when they need you to be quiet. To summarize, being nervous is one of the biggest issues solo players have, and it can really mess up your game and mentality. Luckily, there are multiple ways you can decrease nerves though. You can explain what you're doing while you're playing. You can find out what makes you nervous specifically to find out what pros do in those situations and then expose yourself to those situations repeatedly. And finally, you can trick your brain into being less nervous by chewing gum, for example. I hope everything was clear and you guys enjoyed the video. Next video will either be part 2 of developing a strong mentality or about my second movement course. See you in 2 weeks.